Color correction is an important part of the post-production process. This is where you balance and neutralize all of your clips and give all of your shots a uniform look. Without color correction, your sequence can look disjointed or mismatched. This is a different process than color grading, where you deliberately push the exposure and the saturation and the colors away from the natural to give things a more stylized look to help sell a setting or a particular mood. Although the process of color correction sounds complex, the basics are easy to understand. Hi, my name is Dave Bodie for Envato, and in this course, you are going to learn how to color correct your video in Adobe Premiere Pro. You're going to learn about what color correction is, what footage works best and what doesn't, what sorts of effects are used to adjust footage, how to adjust exposure, saturation, color temperature, secondary color correction, and you'll see a few demonstrations of color correction in action. By the end of this course, you will know how to adjust exposure, adjust saturation, fix color temperature and color cast issues, and more. To get started, check out the next lesson, where you are going to learn what you need to follow along. In this lesson, you're going to learn what you need to get started. So first, and probably most obvious, is you're going to need a computer with Premiere Pro. Now, I'm only going to be using the stock effects that come in Premiere Pro. So as long as you have a recent version of Premiere Pro, you should be able to keep up fine. Now, I am going to be using the Lumetri color engine, and that is something that was fairly recently added in Premiere Pro. I believe it was in the summer of 2015. But I will show you how to use some other color correction effects in there, the three-way color corrector, curves, and fast color corrector very briefly, but most of the color correction that I'm going to be doing is using the Lumetri color panel because it's very fast and it's very easy, which you're going to see coming up in a later lesson. Now, it's also going to be good if you have some familiarity with Premiere Pro. You don't have to be a Premiere expert, but if you have a little bit of experience moving things around, maybe editing a few things together, that's going to be very helpful because this is not a course designed to teach you how to use Premiere from the start. We're going to jump right into color correction. So a little bit of familiarity is going to help. Monitor calibration is also going to be important. Because you're going to be staring at your monitor and making critical color decisions, if your monitor isn't calibrated, if it isn't based in reality, the choices that you're going to be making are going to be skewed all over the place. You may be pushing things warm because your monitor is really blue. So you want to make sure that you get your monitor calibrated. Now, that sounds complicated and maybe a little expensive, but it's really not a big deal. You can pick up a monitor calibrator for around $100 USD and up, and the whole process is fairly straightforward and simple, and it'll get your monitor dialed in to look its best. Now, I like the monitor calibrators with an ambient light sensor because that will help you to set your monitor's brightness, which is an important factor based on the actual lighting in your space, how bright it is. Now, lighting is another important thing when you're making kind of critical color decisions. It's best to have some kind of light-controlled environment, and it's usually best to have it fairly dark because your eyes don't do really fantastically when they have a really bright light source. And your monitor is going to perform much better if it's at a lower brightness level. You'll get much better contrast, and the blacks will be much closer to black. It's usually best to completely block the light coming in from the windows with some blackout curtains and then bring up the light level just a little bit with some artificial lighting. In my space, I have two windows that are completely blocked off, and then I have some very low lighting. In fact, it's so low that I have to have a backlit keyboard because I can't really see the keys. But this way, I get my monitor set up so that it has the most contrast in the deepest blacks, and that's what I like. So that's pretty much it. You're going to need a computer with Adobe Premiere Pro. You're going to have some familiarity with Premiere Pro. Having a decent monitor that's calibrated is very important, and controlled lighting in your space is going to be best for making critical color decisions. Now that you know what you need to follow along, you're ready to move on to the next lesson, where you're going to learn what color correction is and what color correction isn't. Color correction is a specific process, and in this lesson, you're going to learn what it's all about. So the color correction process primarily boils down to three different things: adjusting for exposure, adjusting for saturation, and white balance. Now, this is a process where your goal is to neutralize the clips, to make the colors look normal, to make the exposure look correct. So for exposure, you're going to be looking at adjusting the exposure in the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. Sometimes that's called lift, gamma, gain, or blacks, mids, and whites. There's a few different names for those, but it's all basically the same thing. You have the dark part of the image, you have the middle tones of your image, and then you have the very bright parts of the image. And to get things right, you may need to look at adjusting each one of those separately. You may need to bring up the shadows or bring them down. Same thing with the midtones and the highlights, so that the image looks right and it matches the other clips in the sequence. The same thing happens in saturation. You may need to make targeted adjustments in saturation, so adjusting the shadow saturation or the midtone saturation or the highlight saturation. Or maybe it's more simple. Maybe you just need to bring up the saturation or decrease the saturation so that it looks right and it matches your other clips. White balance is probably the thing that you think of when you think about color correction, because this is essentially balancing the color. It's correcting the color. You may have clips that were shot and the white balance on the camera perhaps wasn't set properly, or it was shot under lights that just have a weird color temperature that couldn't be matched exactly. That needs to be adjusted so that the white looks white, the gray looks gray, and the blacks look black, and then all the other colors look the way they're supposed to look. You may have some kind of light source that's not giving a good quality of light. It may be inexpensive LEDs, fluorescents, or sodium vapor lights, or metal halide lights that give off some weird color cast. This can be orange, or purple, or green. None of those are going to make your footage look right. It's going to alter the way whites and blacks and grays look. And if black, gray, and white don't look right, none of the other colors are going to look right. The shadows are going to be tinted funny, the highlights are not going to look right, the whole image is going to be wrong. So part of the color correction process is getting the color temperature locked in and neutralized, but also it's getting the color cast normalized. So this may mean you need to warm up or cool down your footage and then push things towards maybe magenta or green, or you may need to look at a particular part of the image like the shadows and push those blue or orange to compensate for some really strange colored lights. You basically do whatever you need to do to make the image look right. What color correction isn't is a creative process where you're making stylistic decisions. That's more on the color grading side. Color grading is where you're starting to push the colors away from the neutral and the normal to give things a stylized look. It's also where you're pushing the exposure around. You may be altering the exposure severely to make footage that was shot in the day look like it was shot in the night. Or you may be giving something a lot of contrast or reducing the contrast for a particular style or to try and sell a particular mood. None of those kind of things are color correction. Color correction is a process where you're normalizing the different parts of the image, so your shadows, your midtones, and your whites, and you're adjusting things for exposure, saturation, and color so that the clips look right and they match the other clips in the sequence. Sometimes this process is fairly easy. You can get your color correction dialed in for one clip, copy and paste the effect to all the rest of the clips in your sequence, then make maybe minor adjustments on a few clips. And then other times it's going to take a little bit more work where you're going to have to work from scratch on every clip because every clip looks a little different and you can't just copy and paste settings. Either way, I'm going to show you ways to get it done fairly quickly in this course and hopefully without too much pain. Now that you understand what color correction is, you're ready to move on to the next lesson where you're going to learn about what kind of footage will work best for color correction. The color correction process, like everything else in life, has limits. And those limits are often based on what type of footage you are working with. In this lesson, you're going to find out what types of footage work best for color correction and what type of footage is a little bit more of a challenge. So this idea of working within limits is to set expectations on what is possible in color correction. Now, a lot of folks think that the post-production world, anything is possible. You can take a shot of a vegetable patch and make it look like it was shot on Mars with lasers and explosions and aliens. And I suppose that's true if you have enough money, but for most of us normal folk, there is going to be some limitation. And that limitation is based on what your footage looks like. Think about the color correction process like this. All changes to exposure, saturation, and color are exposure changes. I know that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but let's say you had a clip that was too warm looking, right? It was too orange looking and you wanted to neutralize that. You wanted to push it away from orange. Well, away from orange is towards blue. You're not going to be desaturating it. That's not going to fix it. You need to push the color in the direction of blue because that's opposite of orange. When you do that, you're not pushing around magic pixels, you're re-exposing pixels. You're taking the red channel and the green channel and you're re-exposing them. The red comes down and more importantly, the blue channel comes up. You're re-exposing the blue channel. The pixels that are in blue, the pixels that have blue information, you're increasing those pixels' exposure. And the pixels that have a lot of red, you're decreasing the red exposure. Saturation and exposure also deal with re-exposing pixels, pushing them up in exposure, pushing them down in exposure. So when you have footage that's already really contrasty and really saturated, the levels are going to be really close to the limits, which means when you start pushing pixels around, you're going to hit the limits, and things are going to start to get clipped. And clipped generally doesn't look great. Also consider this. Most of the footage that you're going to be working with is lossy, meaning that at some point in the encoding process from the sensor to you, information was thrown out the window. The way they encode the footage, they don't give a lot of information to the things that are really dark. Most of the bandwidth, if you will, in the encoding process is focused in on the brightest things. When you try to bring up those shadows, because there's less data and information there, if you need to brighten that area up, you're going to see more really nasty compression artifacts. So it's best to work with footage that is flatter, footage that's less contrasty, less sharpened, and less saturated. If you were just to play this footage back, you would say, that footage does not look fantastic. But it's usually better to work with in color correction because the values are not so close to those limits and you still have some range to work with. Your highlights still have detail. Your shadows aren't pushed down so low that they're not getting any encoding bandwidth. And so when you make adjustments to those, you have room to work. You have detail. Because if you don't have detail in the brightest parts and the darkest part of your image, that's going to introduce limitations. And so that's not going to be the best thing. So some cameras will offer some kind of flatter picture profile to work with, and that's going to give you better results. Even better than dealing with flatter looking footage is a camera that shoots to some kind of log profile. A camera that shoots to some kind of log profile basically remaps brightness values so that it's able to squeeze more information into the same amount of encoding bandwidth. When you look at this footage and you play it back without adjusting it, it looks even worse than flat looking footage. It actually looks really bad. But in the color correction process, you apply something called a lookup table, which basically remaps those brightness values back to where they were supposed to be, but you're able to squeeze out a little bit more detail if you record it in this log profile. Raw footage is even better in terms of the amount of information and data that you may be working with, but for most folks, that's not going to be a realistic solution because, for one, you can't use raw footage right out of the camera. It has to be interpolated and then transcoded into some kind of video format that you can actually edit. And the size requirements for raw are astronomical, and that is not going to work for most folks. But shooting with a camera that shoots to log or a flat picture profile is going to be in the realm of possibility. So the takeaway here is log footage or flatter looking footage is going to be better to work with. You're going to have more room to push things around. Now, hopefully, you won't need to push things around a lot. It would be great if you didn't have to do a whole lot of massaging of the colors or very severe exposure adjustments. But when you do need to make large adjustments to the picture, you're going to want room to work. And so flat looking footage and log footage is going to be the best. That's not to say that you can't fix high contrast footage, but you're going to have a little less room to work. Now that you understand what type of footage will give you the best results, you're ready to move on to the next lesson, where you're going to learn about the order of operations. Knowing when to do an operation can be very helpful, and in this lesson, you will learn best practices for working on your footage. In the video editing process, it makes sense to know when to color correct your footage. If you color correct it too early, you're going to be doing extra work because you may be color correcting shots that you're never going to use, or you're going to be focusing in on parts of clips that may be trimmed out. So in general, the video editing workflow goes something like this: import, organize, trim your clips, assemble a rough edit, refine your edit, mix audio, color correct, color grade, finalize, and export. Now, those steps are not locked in stone. There's some fluidity there, but it makes sense to push color correction to one of the last things that you do. Like I said before, you don't want to be color correcting footage that you're not going to use in the edit. Now, I know for me personally, sometimes I don't wait to the very last step to do color correction. I may work on a few clips before I'm finished with my edit because, well, I have a personal problem and I can't stand looking at clips that look crazy. It messes with my head and it distracts me. So for me, I like to do just a little tweaking on certain clips ahead of time. But in general, you do want to leave it to that last step. Now, once you're in the color correction mode, you want to work on the exposure first, then maybe saturation, and then white balance or color temperature, if you will. But the most important thing is to make sure that you're working on the exposure first. Doing a bunch of color modification and then adjusting the exposure can lead to problems because once you start pushing the exposure around, you may reveal some more color issues that you need to retweak. So it makes sense to set your mid, your black, and your highlight point, get that dialed in first, then take care of saturation and color temperature. Now, to further drill down in color correction and color grading, I found a good article that talks about some advice given by Stu Maschwitz. In that article, it talks about an order of operations between color correction and color grading, and it basically goes like this. First, you want to remove artifacts and denoise, then move on to color correction, so setting your blacks, mids, and whites, working on your saturation and color temperature, then relighting using power masks or power windows or just regular masks depending on the application, then adding gradients or diffusions or lens filter type effects. After that, add your vignettes, then move on to color grading, then add your film stock emulation or your grain or your noise, and then finally resize and sharpen. Now, every clip is not going to need all those processes done, but the general takeaway is that color correction comes before all of that other stuff, before noise and grain, before you color grade, before vignettes, before diffusion or lens filters, before you resize and resharpen. Work on your color correction first. So now that you know when to work on color correction, it's time to jump into Premiere and get to work. Coming up in the next lesson, you're going to learn about some of the scopes that will help you in your color correction process. Your eyes are pretty good at telling you what's going on with your picture, but scopes are even better. In this lesson, you will learn about the scopes that can help with your color correction process. So I'm here in Premiere Pro, and I have a project open called Color Correction in Premiere _start. Now, in your source files, you should have access to this so that you can get the same layout as I'm using here. If for whatever reason you don't see something that looks similar to this, just jump up here to the menu under Window, Workspaces, and choose Color. Now that'll bring up essentially the same tools here. You'll have some more panels open. You can just close whatever you don't see here because we're not going to use those. So let's talk about scopes. You can see right over here, I have a panel docked called Lumetri Scopes. If I right-click in this panel, I have access to 5 different types of scopes. I have a waveform, and there's a few different options in what I can see. I have a parade type of scope. I have a histogram, a vector scope, YUV, and a vector scope HLS. Now, we don't have time to go into all of these in great detail, but I just want to show you 2 that we'll be using throughout this course, and they're the 2 that I find the most useful. And that is this one right here, which is the RGB parade, and this vector scope here, which is the YUV vector scope. I'm just going to uncheck the vector scope here, and let's talk about this RGB parade waveform here. This displays the red, green, and blue signal in your image, and it's showing you the luminance in each one of these channels. Now, this can be read from left to right, and this area right here corresponds to the entire image here, but only in the red channel. The same thing for the green, and the same thing for the blue. So if you look in the image here, you'll see that there's a white softbox here that's very, very bright white, and there's some white over here. And over on the scope, I can see that the red channel is at 100% right here. And here, and these two lines correspond to this part of the image and this part of the image right here. Same thing in the green channel and same thing in the blue channel. So already, this scope is telling me that this part of the image is completely clipped, which means there's no more detail. There's no more detail we can extract from the red channel, the green channel, or the blue channel. That's all there is. It's just white, which means if I were to underexpose this, there's no more detail that can be recovered here because it's white. So if I pull down the exposure, it's just going to become a darker shade of white, which is gray. This scope is also very useful for showing you the relationship between these three channels, which is extremely helpful in color balancing your image. You can see if I push this image towards blue, watch what happens here in the scope. The blue channel gets exposed up and the red channel gets exposed down. The opposite happens when I push this towards orange. The red channel gets exposed up and the blue channel gets exposed down. A little bit happens in the green, but mostly it's a relationship between the red and the blue. Now watch what happens when I push this towards green. Green gets exposed up and red and blue get exposed down. If I push up magenta, the exact opposite happens. Green gets exposed down and red and blue get exposed up. You can also see at the lower part of the scope, this is representing the dark values here. So lots of dark patches right here. This looks essentially almost completely black, but I can see on the scopes here that it's actually not completely black. Completely black would be 0 down here. And because it's just a little bit above 0, it means there's a little bit of detail here. So if I were to expose this up, you can see that there is some detail. I can see just the outline of a shape here. Now, it's not very good because there's not much detail there, but there is a little detail there, and that's represented down here on these scopes. Now, the vector scope, YUV, displays a circular chart similar to a color wheel. And this is showing you chrominance information. So chrominance is color. And this corresponds with the standard color wheel. So you can see red is up in this region here. And although it's not exact, it's pretty darn close. And you have these very specific color targets. So this is pure red, pure magenta, pure blue, cyan, green, and yellow. When you're trying to color correct and make sure skin tones are correct, this is the scope you want to look at because this line right here represents orange, and that's where you want to see skin tones fall. As we move out, things become more saturated. I'll show you here. If I just super saturate this image, you can see there's a lot more things that are hypersaturated. And as we push the saturation down, this scope shrinks, showing me that there's not a lot of color information here. So this is another very useful scope to show you what the color is doing, showing you how much saturation there is and where that saturation is falling. Now that you understand the basics behind the scopes that you're going to see used throughout the rest of this course, you're ready to move on to the next lesson, where you're going to get an overview of some of the basic tools that are used to do color correction. So check that out coming up next. There are many different tools that can help you in your color correction process. Many of them do a very similar thing, but they work a little differently. In this lesson, you will learn about a few of the commonly used tools that you will find in video editors. I'm going to get rid of this effect that's on this clip here. This clip is Bodhi with Color Checker. And I'm going to jump over here to the Effects tab and twirl down Video Effects, and under Color Correction, you're going to see several effects that you can use to help with color correction. One of these you've actually already seen, that's Lumetri Color. This is a new color correction tool that was added in Premiere fairly recently. This is a very powerful tool. It's very easy to use. It emulates the color correction process in the tone controls in Adobe Lightroom. It's very fast to use. I love it. But you won't find this exact tool in every video editor. Most video editors will have some standard tools, things like RGB curves and three-way color correctors or color wheels, which you'll see right here. I'm going to add this to the clip just so you can see what this looks like. And so you can use this to adjust the color tint of the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights separately. I'm just going to reset all those there. You can also click Master here, and we can adjust the overall tone of the entire image. So this is the three-way color corrector. There are many, many more aspects to it. I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to pull up the fast color corrector. This is another tool that has a color wheel here, and this is for making, well, it's for making fast color corrections. So we don't have highlight, midtones, and shadows. We just have one color wheel that we can use to change the hue, or we can use to push the colors in a particular direction to balance out the image. I'm just going to reset that here. There's also controls in both the fast color corrector and the three-way color corrector to adjust the levels of the image, basically to re-expose things globally. So we can pull down the shadows, we can raise the midtones, we can push things brighter, and we can re-expose our image to adjust and make things look right. And finally, I want to show you curves. Curves is another very standard video effect. And you can see that this gives you a graph for the master kind of overall luminance, and then it's broken out by channel, red, green, and blue. And so with this effect, you can do things like adjust the exposure, so I can make this brighter or darker. I can give this more contrast by clicking and adjusting this curve here. I can also adjust the colors here, so I can take the reds down, I can push the blues up, and this graph here represents kind of luminance level. So up here is more the highlight area, down here is the shadow area, and you can do very fine adjustments with this tool as well. So if I wanted to, for example, I'll just reset this here, put a point right in the middle here. I could pull down just the red shadows here, and you can see that over here on the scopes. And it's adjusting a little bit up here, but because I have those other points there, there's not much else adjusting in the reds. And so you can use this in a very similar way to the color wheels. It just looks and works a little bit differently. And you're going to see this used in more detail coming up later in the course as well. And like I mentioned before, there is the Lumetri color engine. This is a fantastic tool. Most of the time, this is what I use because it's extremely fast, and unlike these other effects, you can have this panel up and loaded here, and with any clip selected, all you have to do is move some of these values here, and the effect gets applied right over here. Whenever you have this clip selected, you don't have to jump over here to the effects controls and mess around with the settings. You can do everything in the Lumetri color panel here, and it's very, very convenient to do that. I'll just reset this here. In addition to these basic white balance, temperature, tint, and tone controls, there are some creative things that you can do in here: sharpen, vibrant, saturation, faded film, and there's also some looks that are loaded here, and you can create your own custom looks to kind of grade your footage. I'm not going to be talking about that in this course, but I just wanted to mention it. There's also curves available here in the Lumetri color panel in this effect. So this does a very similar thing as the RGB curves because we have RGB curves here as well. We also have a hue saturation curve, which is another way to use curves and adjust colors. And we have color wheels as well. And lastly, we have a vignette here, which is more kind of on the grading, creative end of things. But with this one effect, you can do almost everything that you want to do in color correction. So this is the one that I use the most. But sometimes I can get a better look with either RGB curves or the three-way color corrector, or a combination of the three-way color corrector, RGB curves, and the fast color corrector, or any combination of those. So it's good to know that these tools are there and that they do a similar thing, but they do work differently. So now that you have a basic understanding of the tools that are going to be used throughout this course, you're ready to move on to the first example coming up in the next lesson, where you're going to learn how to adjust the blacks, the midpoints, and the whites and adjust exposure in your shot. So check that out coming up next. In this lesson, you will learn how to adjust your blacks, mids, and whites. So let's say that you had a shot that you wanted to make an adjustment on. You looked at it and said, this shot is too dark, or this shot is a little bit too bright, Or maybe you want to make an adjustment to make it look more similar to another shot, and you need to adjust the exposure. And I'm going to find a different shot here. I'm just going to double click on my example clips, and I'll set this to icon view, and I'll dock this right over here. Let's look at this circus mermaid clip. So I'm just going to drag this out on the timeline here. So this shot right here, I may want to bring things up a little bit because it doesn't look quite right to my eye here. So if I wanted to brighten up this circus mermaid person here, I'd want to adjust the exposure a little bit. Now, if I look at my scopes, I can see that this image has quite a bit of contrast in it. We have things that are very, very dark, possibly completely black, and there are some very, very bright points like these lights here, which are essentially fully white. So right up here in the Lumetri color panel, under basic correction, I have some very simple tone controls that I can use to adjust the exposure. The first one, that seems very obvious, is exposure. So I can just click and drag this, and this will expose my image up. Now, like I talked about in a previous lesson, there is in fact only so far you can go with adjusting the exposure and pushing values around until the image completely falls apart. Let's say, for example, I wanted to expose this up 2 full stops. Well, if you're looking at this kind of fit view here, you'd say, well, that doesn't look too bad. I'd say that looks pretty good. But if we jump into 100% and we look down here, you can see some of those compression artifacts rearing their ugly heads. And you're going to see that as you start pushing the values around, especially in the dark areas, like I mentioned before. Check out all of this black ceiling jazz happening up here. Look at all that blocky madness. That's not super attractive. So there are limits of what we can do here. Even though that looks like a better exposure, we are revealing some of those compression artifacts. And if that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. And you may be able to look at denoising or doing some creative addition of noise to try and hide those compression artifacts. Or maybe in the scope of just playing this, they're not that bad. Now, I can see down here that they actually are that bad, and that would drive me completely bonkers, this kind of jaggy artifact nonsense. But we don't have to expose the image up that far, and we don't have to push just the overall exposure up. We may be able to just push up the midtones. And we have some other controls here that we can look at to see what's going to make that happen. We can look at pushing up the shadows, and maybe that will find where we're looking for here. I'm guessing that this is kind of in the lower mid-tone range. I mean, obviously these pants aren't. Those are quite bright. But we may be able to do something like pushing up the exposure and then pulling down the shadows to pull down this area back to somewhere that kind of hides that nasty artifacting just a little bit. Now, I'm going to reset this and show you that there are some other controls in here. If I jump down to color wheel, I can take the midtones and I can push those up. I can also just take the shadows and push those back down. This is doing a very similar thing, and this may be a different way that gets the image to look the way you want it without perhaps revealing those nasty artifacts. Let me jump back here to this shot here. Let's say I just wanted to make a small exposure adjustment here. With the clip selected, I could just come over here and just push this up a little bit. And because I'm making a small adjustment, you're not going to see a huge difference here in the image. You're not going to start to see nasty compression artifacts. Now, this was shot with a different camera. This clip here was shot with a DSLR, and this clip here was shot with a Canon C100, which has a much better image to it, so it's going to give me a little bit more latitude in how far I can push this. But still, if I push this up 2 stops, you're going to see that there's a good amount of noise here in the image. But this is usually the first thing that you want to do, is make sure you get your exposure nailed down. Because if you do a lot of color manipulation and then you try and re-expose it, what you'll find is when you make that exposure adjustment, the colors may get way out of whack really quickly. So it's best to try and get your black point, basically where your shadows are at, your midpoints and your highlights, kind of set before you move forward. So now that you have the basics of exposure adjustment, you're ready to move on to the next lesson. Coming up in the next lesson, you're going to learn how to adjust the white balance of your clips. In this lesson, you will learn how to white balance your clips. Now, most of the time when you think about color correction, this is the thing that you're thinking about. How do I correct the colors because the white balance is off? Maybe the clip was shot under some strange color temperature lights or some lower quality color temperature lights. Maybe the white balance was set wrong on the camera. These are all problems that you need to deal with, and I'm going to really quickly show you a few ways to handle it. Now first, I want to show you some kind of reference, which is why I've included this Adobe with color checker. This color checker here is a reference color target. And although there's not an automated way to use this target in Premiere, or at least to use these color chips, we can use these black, gray, and white values here to pretty quickly get a nice white balance on this image. So let me show you how that works. The first thing you want to do is grab the three-way color corrector. I want to zoom in here to 200%. And so first, grab the shadow white balance color picker here and click the dark part of the image. Then grab the midtones, click this middle gray here, and then grab the highlights color picker and choose the white. Now it still may not be 100% correct, so we can grab a fast color corrector, grab the white balance here, and just pick this guy right here. And let's check this out. With these two effects here, we can get the colors pretty much dialed in a matter of seconds here. So that's one way to do it. If you have some kind of reference in your shot, if you have something that you know is pure gray, or you know is pure white, and it's not clipped, or you know you have something that's very, very dark gray and doesn't have any color in it, you can use these little color pickers here to get the shot close. I'll show you another example. You can also just kind of eyeball this and say, okay, this looks way too orange. So over here in the Lumetri color, I can just push this towards blue. And I'll push this maybe a little bit more magenta. So it may be that I need to come down here to the color wheels and push the shadows more towards blue or cyan to balance out this stuff down here. Because if the shadows look warm, that kind of skews your eye. So I would say that that looks a lot closer, kind of balancing out these darker shadow regions here with the red, green, and blue. And that to me looks pretty close. These buildings look right. I'm guessing that these lights have an orange glow, and so that actually looks right. But if I uncheck this, you can see there's a massive difference there. So you have to use a little knowledge of what lights look like and which direction to push it, but basically it kind of works in opposites. If it's too orange, you push it more to this kind of cyan-y blue color here. If it's too green, you push it towards magenta. Let's look at another example really quick. Here's a shot of some colored pencils, and this was shot under some lower quality compact fluorescent lighting. And at first glance, you'd say, well, maybe that doesn't look too bad, but I would say that that looks green. So let me show you one way that you can isolate a part of the image and make an adjustment. I'm going to grab the crop effect, throw that on here. I'm going to click on it, and that brings up these bounding boxes here. And I'm just going to move these to only select this white portion right here, which is actually, it's not white, it's kind of a very light gray. Then I'm going to click zoom, and that's going to fill the image with this, which is going to make reading these scopes a heck of a lot easier, because if it's like this, you can see that I can't really see exactly what's going on. It's more difficult. So by filling the frame full of this information, it's a lot easier to see what's going on here. And what I can see from the RGB scope here is that things look a little bit green. So I could come up here to my basic correction and push this towards magenta, and that'll bring the green down and bring the red and the blue up a little bit. But now things are looking a little blue, so I may have to kind of balance these guys out with that green. And my goal here is just to try and level out these scopes to make this light gray color even with red, blue, and green. I would say something like that is pretty close. It's not exact. Now check out what happens when I take this crop effect off. This is what it was before, and this is what it is now. You can see that the before image definitely looks green, and the corrected image looks better. But a lot of times I use this crop effect here to isolate a specific part of the image and then color correct to that. Really quickly, I'll show you one more example here. I'm just going to hazard a guess that this building over here is gray. So I'm just going to isolate that, zoom on it, and then make an adjustment here to neutralize what's going on here. Just like that. So that looks pretty close to gray. Neutralizing that. Then I take the crop effect off. And now I have an image that looks perhaps a little bit more correct. This part of the image right here, this building, like I said, I don't know if that's actually gray, but I was just guessing. And I think that looks right. But if I wanted to back this off a little bit, maybe that's a happy medium. And that definitely looks better to my eye than that. That definitely looks too blue, and that looks more correct. Now that you know how to adjust the color temperature and color cast of your clips, you're ready to move on to the next lesson, where you're going to learn how to use the vector scope to check skin tones. In this lesson, you will learn how to use the vector scope to check if skin tones are correct. I have this clip here, female student hoodie, and the color definitely doesn't look right in this shot. So to start, I may adjust the exposure here, maybe just bring up these midtones a little bit, just to lighten it up. If you have something that's in the shot that is supposed to be neutral color, this can make the process quite a bit easier. And this girl here is wearing a gray sweatshirt. So I'm going to come over here to the effects and grab a crop effect. I'm going to throw that on here, and then I'm going to click on it and just grab the bounding box here and just crop in on a part of her shirt. And then I'm going to click zoom. So I can reference this gray sweatshirt, this patch of gray here, with my scopes and try and neutralize the colors. I can see blue is looking a little low, so I'm going to push this over to blue right about there. And now it's looking green, and I can see there's a lot of green information here. So I'm going to push this towards magenta. And right about there, this gray is fairly neutralized, maybe a little less blue. That looks pretty good. Now when I take the crop effect off, you're going to see that this looks a heck of a lot better. This is the before, and now you can see this definitely did look green and kind of reddish orange. And now things look a lot better. Now, it's possible that this gray was actually a little bit blue, and I think overall this looks maybe a tad blue. So I would perhaps warm this back up a little bit because that looks a little bit more natural. I'm going to reset this crop effect here, and I can also check on what the skin tones are doing to make sure they're along that vector scope line. So I'm just going to crop in here on a bit of her forehead, and then I'm going to jump over to the vector scope, and I should see if this is close to being right, the skin here is going to be right along that line. And look at that. It is. If I push the saturation, you're going to see it's right along this line there, and that means the skin tones are the right color. Now this does look a little undersaturated, but that's something we're going to look at how to address in an upcoming lesson. Now that you know how to check the color of your skin tones, you're ready to move on to the next lesson, where you're going to learn how to adjust the saturation in your clips. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to adjust the saturation of your clips. Now this particular shot was lit with some lower quality compact fluorescent lamps, and those don't reproduce all of the colors. So we may need to juice some of the colors with saturation to make this look correct. Now in Lumetri, there are some saturation controls. We have a saturation slider right here underneath the basic corrections, and you can see what that's going to do down here in the scopes and to the picture. Makes things look more saturated, for sure. The problem is that if we push this up too much, we're getting some clipping here in the reds, and you can see that those red pencils look hyper-saturated, and that's not good. So down here in Creative, we have some more options. We have a vibrance control. Vibrance adjusts the saturation so that clipping is minimized as colors approach full saturation. This setting changes the saturation of all lower saturated colors with less effect on the higher saturated colors. Vibrance also protects skin tones from becoming oversaturated. Now there's another effect that I can look at as well, The three-way color corrector has some different saturation controls. I have a master saturation, a shadow, midtone, and highlight saturation. So if I push up the master saturation, you can see that it essentially looks exactly the same as it did when I did the saturation adjustment over here. But the shadow saturation is going to do something a little bit different. That looks more similar to what vibrance is doing, but it's really only affecting the shadows in the image. So I may be able to push up all the saturation and then maybe pull down the midtone saturation to recover some of that clipped red areas here. So push this up and then pull down the midtones. And you can see that now that's not being clipped, but it's still looking quite a bit more saturated than it was before. If I toggle this on and off, things are looking quite a bit better. And then I can push up the saturation here in the shadows. Now, if I push that up too much, things are going to get nasty looking. So you want to be careful on how much you're adjusting here. And you can get some nasty artifacts there. But the three-way color corrector is another way that you can adjust the image. I usually prefer to use what's in Lumetri here. I think that works pretty well, just juicing up the vibrance here. But you may need to use something else. If I take a look at this other clip here, you can see that this image, because of when I shot it and the lighting conditions, looks really desaturated. I'd probably want to push up the saturation, but I have something in here that's already hyper saturated, this red sign here, and that's going to start clipping out as I push this up, and it's going to get overblown looking, kind of nasty. What I could do is come down here under curves, and I have a hue saturation curve. So I could select the greens by clicking on this button here, and then just taking the greens and saturating those a little bit more. Now, I'd probably have to add 2 more points over here and just expand this green area out, because this green is not the exact color of these green trees here. Oftentimes that's more yellowish. And so I can juice up the colors here in the greens without really affecting what's going on in this red here. And that's starting to make things look a little bit better. I could do the same thing maybe over here in the blues, maybe giving that a little more juice. And then I might be able to do a little bit with the orange and not get so much of that red, which will punch up the sky a little bit while still kind of leaving out that red. Now this is getting a little bit into the almost secondary color correction, but it's another way that you can adjust saturation a little bit more selectively. And you can see I bumped up the saturation quite a bit from where it was initially. I mean, this looks gray and almost looks like I applied some kind of look to it. And this looks more normal. This would be more appropriate if I was cutting this back and forth between something that was shot not in a smog-filled city on an overcast day. So those are some ideas that you can use to adjust the saturation and help the overall color correction of your shots. Coming up in the next lesson, you're going to learn how to do some secondary color correction and correct the colors for specific parts of your image. So check that out coming up next. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to do some secondary color correction. So I pulled out another clip here on the timeline. This is called Student Laptop, made a new sequence here. And really quickly, I'm going to color balance this shot. Just going to kind of eyeball it here. It looks super green. First, I'm going to give it a little bit of exposure, bring it up a little bit, try and get this a little more green and push this a little more blue until the white on his shirt here is looking white, which is something like that. I'd say that looks pretty close. When I did that, I pushed things blue, and the problem is that the lights here from the original shot, this was shot with, I don't know, some kind of crazy green-orange light, but the light coming in from the window was daylight, probably overcast lighting. So uncolor corrected, the light from the window looks somewhat neutralized. But when I made that color correction adjustment and neutralized the colors a good bit on him, now this light coming from the window here looks purple, which is kind of weird. Now, maybe that's not a big deal, but maybe you want to try and fix that. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to grab a three-way color corrector. I'm going to drop that on here. And then down in this section here called secondary color correction, I have some tools here that I can make some selections on this image based on hue, saturation, and luminance. Now, if that all sounds confusing, don't worry about it because there are some color pickers here that make the job very easy. So I'm going to select this first color picker here, and I'm going to pick this color right here on the window shades here. Then I'm going to click Show Mask, and this is going to show me what parts of the image I have selected. Now, what I want to do is select all of this kind of light bleed purple stuff here and shift that so that it doesn't look so purple. So the mask is showing me that I don't have all of it, so I need to add to it. So I'm going to grab this Color Picker Plus and add some more colors to this. Click Show Mask. And I can keep clicking here and add more to this selection. Or I can just twirl down Hue, Saturation, and Luma, and I can move these sliders around until it's selecting what I want it to select. So I'm pretty sure that it's in this color range, so that looks good. But let's see if we can get more of this selection by adjusting these other elements here, the amount that's saturated and the luminance. So I'm guessing that if I push this up, I'm going to get more of that purple area, and that's what I want. I can also feather this down here and make this more of a graduated selection. So you can see here it's kind of super sharp, but if I pull this little triangle here away, it's starting to fade that out and make a smoother selection. Same thing here on the saturation and colors. Now, if I select too many colors, I'm going to start getting things that I don't want, like his skin and his shirt and some other parts of the image. What I really want is this blue kind of purpley area here. And that, I think, is pretty close. Let me turn off the mask here. At the very bottom, there's a couple of controls here. Soften. This is going to blur out that selection a little bit. It's often pretty good to just blur it out because if it's too jaggy looking, that's not going to look great. And then edge thin, and this can grow your selection or shrink it. And I maybe want to grow it just a little bit. Now I'm going to uncheck Show Mask. And now if I come over here to the color wheels, click on Master, I can push these colors around and try and balance them. Now that looks to me too purple. So if I go in the opposite direction, maybe yellow or right about there, that looks right. The colors on this person here don't change. I'll zoom up here so you can see. He remains completely unaltered because the selection, the mask, doesn't have anything to do with him. He's not selected in this mask at all. And so really quickly you can get in there and make very specific adjustments to color. Sometimes you'll need to do this to skin tone. If you get everything else right and the skin tone doesn't look right, you can use this to select the skin tone and make an adjustment so that your skin tone is falling on that vector scope line like we looked at earlier. Coming up in the last lesson, you're going to learn some final tips and tricks to make all of your color corrections a success. In this last lesson, you'll get some final tips and tricks to make all of your color corrections a success. So in the last several lessons, you saw a few different ways to tackle some common color correction problems. How to adjust the exposure, how to adjust the white balance, how to make some tweaks to the saturation so that things are not super saturated but still increase the overall saturation, and how to do some secondary color corrections. I did leave you with a few more clips for you to practice with, and you can experiment using these effects that we looked at, the fast color corrector, the three-way color corrector, curves, Lumetri color, and you can check out some of the other effects that are included with Premiere Pro as well. So you might take this clip, which is just crazy looking, and you may experiment with using a curves effect to try and pull this back to reality, because this looks like it was shot on, I don't know, the surface of Mars or something. And so you may come in here and make some adjustments and try and balance things out with the curves so that things look a little more in the realm of reality. And depending on the shot that you're working on, there may be only so much that you can do with it, but you may find that you like working with curves a little bit better, or you may like working with another effect to try and adjust what's going on in these clips. There's a lot of different ways to solve these problems, and so hopefully what you can take away from this is the general concepts of looking at the colors. And sometimes you can have a shot that really doesn't take much work at all. One effect may be all you need to pull it back to reality and make it look right. Sometimes you have a shot that looks really good right out of the box, and so you really don't need to do much to it at all. Sometimes it's just a few clicks in this basic corrections tab of Lumetri, and that's all it really needs. Again, make sure you're utilizing these scopes here. The RGB parade and the vector scope are very, very useful, especially if you need to check that your skin tones look right. It can be hard to judge, your eyes can play tricks on you. So get in here, throw a crop effect on to check your skin tones and to make sure that your shots are color balancing. And you're using something here that's more accurate than what your eyes can tell you. And don't forget that a calibrated monitor is going to be very important in this process as well, because you're going to be able to utilize your eyes a heck of a lot more if the thing that you're looking at is calibrated properly. If you have a monitor that's skewed towards blue, then you're going to be making decisions that are not based in reality. I hope that the things that you learned in this course will help you in your color correction journey. Thanks again for watching this course. My name is David Bodie for Envato, and I'll see you around.